Here we are, malt embedded sustainability for your brand. So what this is about how you can look at sustainability and how can it can be important for your brand. If you're trying to verify sustainability, then you need to know that the information that's behind what you're getting from your supplier is realistic. So here we are. I've got a couple of hats on today, Director of Technical and Sustainability for Muntons, and also I run a sustainability consultancy called Malt Doctor Limited. As you know, there's a race to zero, and lots of people get very angry, don't they, about the environment and about sustainability. And if you could just harness some of that feeling that people have and move it in the right direction, it would be so much better, wouldn't it? So the UK is committed to net zero, isn't it, by 2050? And even yesterday, we had it announced that we are going to be fast tracking that to 78% by 2035. Now, what do you think about that? Do you think that's crazy? Well, I don't think it's crazy. I hope you don't, because the point is that we're really quite behind in many ways globally in trying to stop the global impact of man on climate change. And I say that very carefully because climate change, of course, will happen whether we do anything or not, but maybe we're just tipping it over the edge by what we're doing. We've only got about 20 years to stop that tipping over the edge. And we've seen, haven't we, with COVID that's gone on at the moment, it's not the way we'd want to control greenhouse gases, is it? Of course it isn't. We've saved about 11% of carbon whilst COVID has been on. But I think it shows that where we can have a big impact. We've looked at air travel, we've looked at road travel. So people are talking about a post-COVID recovery, and they're talking about social governance, etc. One of the key ways, though, for business to get involved is to view it in a slightly different way, so that you're not environmental campaigners, particularly as a business. You shouldn't be really in that field at all, I suspect, if you're a business. That should be happening. Others should be maybe using that as a motivational tool, perhaps. The model that a lot of people have adopted is the people, the profit, and the planet model. What that says is, first of all, that it's not wrong to make a profit if you're an environmentally go-ahead company. If you're in business, of course, you're going to make a profit, but you should be able to do that in a way which doesn't damage the planet and which engages with people. So very important to think about that. Now, the problem is we are behind with our targets. So if you look at the path we're supposed to be on, the red line, which for the UK has just got a little bit steeper, and the green line is where we are at the moment. And the EU have analysed this, and they've had a look at how much carbon we're saving. So, for example, if you look at that period from 1990 to 2017, we have about a 38% reduction that we've achieved in the carbon footprint. Not too bad. That is the impact, though, of legislation, but it's not the whole impact of legislation. So the estimate there is that about 40% of that saving has come through legislation, which means that 60% has come from business. And I think that's the encouraging part. The rest of these slides will show how business has done some of that already and how it will achieve even more as we go forward. The point is, though, that if business doesn't get on with it, we will be legislated. So we do need to get ahead of the track here. The UK, even before yesterday, had published this document called the Net Zero Report. Now, sadly, when the Net Zero Report came out, it very quickly got the title of the Not Zero Report. Now, that's not really very helpful because that means that people have written it off really before they've even given it a chance to work, and that's not the way to work. The UK is the first country to make net zero a legally binding target. So guess what? We can't ignore the information that's coming from government, because that will frame the legislation that we're all going to have to live by. But isn't this carbon footprinting something which is quite complicated? Well, it can be, but it can also be simple. Now, if you're looking at that graph, you might think he's just said it's simple. It doesn't look that simple to me. There's arrows going everywhere. But when we break the carbon footprint down, if it's your first time hearing about a carbon footprint, any activity that we do is translated into the impact of the gas that we emit into the atmosphere. So we can emit a whole range of gases which hold heat into the atmosphere, and they hold different amounts of heat. Nitrogen gases hold 300 times more heat in the atmosphere than CO2. But if you work out how much of each of those gases that you put into the atmosphere, you can translate it all back to one carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, there are different ways in which you can make that carbon footprint. There's a scope 1, which is everything you are directly responsible for on your site. Scope 2 is everything which is indirect, and that can be the electricity that you buy. It could be heat that you buy in. The one that fills most people with fear is scope 3. So scope 3 is divided into two parts. It's scope 3 downstream and scope 3 upstream. Downstream is the one which you've probably got consultants crawling all over you trying to get you to measure. But for malting, for example, which bit is the most significant? Well, when we calculate it, you can see there on the slide that scope 3 downstream is only about 3% of the total carbon footprint for malt, which means you have a choice then. You could spend a lot of money going out and calculating that very, very accurately, or you could use one of the models which takes financial spend in those areas and predicts it for you. Now, my view is that if it's only 3% of the total footprint, you don't want to spend a lot of money trying to make that better. However, if you look at scope 1 and scope 2, you're going to get invoices for those. You will know exactly, because you can convert it easily from scope 1 and scope 2. And then for scope 3 upstream, that's the one really which is the challenge. It's for most maltings, it will be the procurement of barley. And there are carbon calculators out there. I've just recently, in fact, I heard yesterday, the one I've designed for Euromalt has been signed off. There are others out there. There's the Cool Farm tool, which just looks at barley itself. The Euromalt calculator tries to put that together into the whole of the carbon footprints from scope 1 to scope 3 and gives you the data that you need for streamlined energy and carbon reporting, SECR, which many of us will have to report for the first time this year. So it's horses for courses, but they're all good in different ways. But we've just said that it's barley which is the biggest contributor. How do farmers feel about that? Well, you know what? They're actually surprisingly positive about it. If you look at the Ipsos Mori survey, which has come out of initiatives as well, things like the Good Growth Plan of Syngenta, I think is a really good example of that. 72% of farmers say they're concerned about the effects of climate change. 87% say they've experienced at least one environmental impact. 59% think it would give them a competitive advantage. Now, perhaps you are a bit surprised at that, but it's borne out by other data as well. So, for example, if you look at the statistics that came out from DEFRA in September 2020, they've also looked at the impact on farming. And again, if you look there, 18% think it's very important to consider greenhouse gases in land management. Around half thought it was fairly important, so maybe they were a little on the fence, but it's still not a bad percentage. But whatever they thought, 66%, 2/3 of them were taking action to reduce their emissions. So it's all good news, isn't it? Yeah, it's not bad. It's 5% better, those figures, than in 2019. But maybe not surprisingly, larger farms were taking action more than smaller farms. But the bit we need to think about is that 30% of the respondents placed little or no importance on this subject area. But when you delve down, it's because they felt they were ill-informed about it. Well, I think that's quite encouraging, because that means that we've got a job to inform them. We don't have to think that 30% are disenfranchised and will never follow it. So I think that's all very positive about farmers. Now, which carbon footprint calculators should you use to calculate the impact of barley? In my view, it really doesn't matter. You might say, well, you've just designed your own. Shouldn't you be promoting your own as or the Euromalt one as the best one there? I would like to think it's one of the best ones, he says, as his head swells to fill the screen. No, but the reason I'm saying that is because if you look at the different calculators and you compare them in an equal way, there's very little difference between them. Here's a couple of examples. They're only 6% different. That means, if you've heard me say this before, that means they're 94% similar. And I wish I was 94% similar sure of every decision I made. If you split it up, it's divided then from barley growing in largely the use of fertilizer and the manufacture of the fertilizer. And that means that you can start using this footprinting exercise to go and talk to your supply chain partners, to find out what they're actually doing about this area, because anything they do will reduce the amount of carbon that's embedded in your product. We found when we started that it was difficult for farmers to engage, so we made our own carbon footprint calculator. I designed this in 2 weeks, and that created a whole load of flack for me, because people were charging thousands of pounds for carbon calculators, and thought that really my HIC calculator, as they were trying to call it, was really not going to cut the mustard when it came to calculations. However, Farmers Weekly told me at the time that it suddenly became the 3rd most widely used calculator in the UK. Why? Because it was simple, and actually, if you looked at the most complex calculator, and even if you look at the calculators available now, they are very, very close to the values that we obtained with those 9 questions. Of those 9 questions, we found that it really mattered if farmers were using the new type of fertilizer which was available, which roughly halved the impact of the production of the fertilizer in the embedded carbon. So guess what? As Muntons, we said, well, if it's the same cost as the existing fertilizer, we will simply then specify in our contracts that our growers must use that. And that's enabled us, amongst other things, to achieve a 30% lower barley carbon footprint over about a 10-year period. So we're quite pleased that sometimes you can have a 0 cost and get a massive change in carbon footprint. Now, having said that carbon footprint isn't complicated, you might be looking at this slide thinking, what the heck has he just put up on the screen? You can get very, very specific about carbon footprinting, and if you're talking to sustainability professionals in your supply chain, they will want to know this data. They will want to see your scope 1, 2, and 3 data. They will want to see how much you've reduced it. They will want to see a pie chart to see how it's distributed through your supply chain. But you know what? The bit I'm most interested in is the graph in the bottom left, which says that's all well and good, but what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? So if you look at the data there from Muntons there in the top graph, we've achieved a 15% reduction in scope 1, 50% in scope 2, and 30% in scope 3, as I've just explained. Where's the 50% in scope 2 come from? Remember, this is electricity generation, and it's any heat that we buy in which we happen not to. Well, in 2014, we have a brewery on site. It's a 4 million hectolitre brewery. We decided that the sugar waste from that, as you wash out, we could process anaerobically and generate methane, make electricity for the site, so you get a drop down there. We put in a biomass boiler up at our Bridlington maltings in 2019, and you can see a big drop there in emissions, and we're doing the same thing, and that's the predicted figure for 2020 and 2021. We're going to get an even bigger drop in that, and I'll show you some of those in a moment. But they're practical things, existing technology which you can use now. Let's just, for a moment, then look elsewhere at where greenhouse gas emissions may come from. The World Resources Institute has looked at the impact of agriculture, and remember that's a fairly big embedded part of our carbon that we will pass on to brewers and distillers. They're saying that a 73% reduction now seems possible. That's very, very close to the 78% we heard mentioned yesterday we need to get to by 2035. And this is in just one part of the supply chain. But how many people think that's real? And what does it entail? How are you going to get there? Well, reduced demand and reduced food waste is going to take 5 of that 15 billion away. You can get increases in crop yields, etc. will take 1.5. You can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that come from agriculture that generates methane, or reduce your emissions from the fertilizer that you use, another 3 billion. And then you can restore ecosystems. Interestingly, the data coming out now says maybe we don't want to plant too many more forests, because actually if we're not careful, we take up the land that is particularly good at restoration and actually plant more peatlands. That doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't use peat, because it's a tiny, tiny proportion of the peat that's used worldwide is used for that wonderful flavor they get in whiskey. But what it's recognizing is that the land can hold a lot more carbon, and maybe is more of an answer here than perhaps we thought before. What that does mean is that when you've got down to all of that, the bit that's left is then the bit you think about offsetting. And that's very much the way we need to think about it. Don't think of offsetting as your first choice when you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint. What is the contribution of the malt to the various supply chains that you'll represent on this call? So if you look at For example, the contribution of malt within a can in North America, and this is data which is plotted from the Beer Roundtable report in 2012, it's about 33%. If you look at it in a glass bottle in Europe, it's about 39%. So shall we say it's 40%? That's why it's important for maltsters that we look at that, because as brewers, you will be looking to say, well, at 40%, maybe we'll take that out as an ingredient. Well, if you take it out as an ingredient, you sure as heck won't have the same product, will you? You won't have the flavor profile in there. So we don't want you to do that, and I'm sure you don't want to do that either. What you can do, though, is to say, if you talk to your suppliers and say, well, what are you doing to reduce that? Well, I've already shown that you can do quite a lot to target maybe a 50% reduction in that going forward. And we've got 30% in barley already, and you'll see some of those big drops in there that we're able to drop our carbon footprint substantially using other technology. And if you look at whiskey again, whiskey is about 42% embedded carbon. So it's all around about the same proportion. So, it's something where you can certainly focus your attention, talk to your malting supplier about what are we doing to reduce that carbon footprint. But the breweries and distilleries have done quite a lot as well. This is not a doom and gloom talk. If you look at there have been tremendous improvements in energy use, in water use, and in total emissions in brewing and distilling over the past few years, from 2013 to 2017. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about sustainability. It's not a new activity that we're suddenly going to invent. It's trying to interpret sustainability and embed it with all the other activities that we're doing. So we're all going in the right direction, but we need to step up rather, because we are somewhat behind. If you look at those figures, they're nowhere near the 78% that's been announced. One of the things that Muntons chose to do was to then say, well, we need to have an international target. We need to have a science-based target. Science-based target was set up by the CDP program, Carbon Disclosure, UN Global Compact, and the World Resources Institute, and WWF. Why? What was the point of it? It wanted to help companies have a structure to find a way of structuring a carbon reduction pathway going through into the future, and recognize actually that many companies already have the skills, but maybe they don't know how to harness those skills to talk about carbon reduction. Maybe they still talk about energy, and I know that for a fact that many companies don't talk about carbon yet, and need to, because that's what our targets are being set against for the next few years. We'll all have to learn to talk carbon, not energy. Interestingly, 1,000 companies have signed up to science-based targets, but only about 50% have got an agreed target. So that's good, but not as good as it could be. Why should you bother setting a science-based target? Well, 63% of company executives say that it drives innovation. It does, because if you look at the target which the malting industry and the brewing industry between us need to save, it's way up at over even what Boris announced yesterday. It's up at about over 80%. So it's really challenging if you consider what we're saving now. We've saved somewhere between about 15 to 20% over the past 5 or 6 years. We've got to do something dramatically different. 35% of company executives say that it increases regulatory resilience. In other words, we know that the government, if it's going to hit its legal target, is going to have to set us stricter and stricter targets. So being ahead of the curve, or trying to get at least up with the curve, means that we're ready for this. And then 55% of company executives say it gives them a competitive advantage. What that means is that if you're up against a competitor who's about the same price as you, if you've got a legitimate sustainability and verifiable sustainability agenda, you should get the contract ahead of your competitor. And 55% of the time, company executives are saying, yes, that is correct. Of course, it's not all about carbon and water. You will be asked these days, what's your view on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Because it's recognized that the agenda here is multifaceted. There are 17 facets, according to the United Nations. The most important is number 17, partnership. We cannot achieve these goals unless we understand the impact that we're each having in the supply chain. And when this is voted on in most of the seminars I've been to, the number 2 and number 3 choice is either 13, climate action, not surprisingly, but interestingly, number 8 as well, decent work and economic growth. I think that's saying that we realize that we have to work together. We have to take action primarily against carbon impact on the climate, but we still want to be able to have profitable businesses that are sustainable and employ people for the future. Going back to agriculture in terms of making things legitimate, you'll remember that the G20 struggled to get a definition of sustainability, but there is an organization called the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative Platform, SCI platform. It developed some years back a farm sustainability assessment. So for different raw materials around the world, so in different geographies, it was able to find one definition of sustainability. Now, that definition was either a bronze level, you could just about be sustainable, or silver, or gold if you were wonderful at it. So it allowed companies then to set different targets in different geographies for different crops on a different trajectory if they needed to. In fact, it was relaunched just yesterday, the Farm Sustainability Assessment. You've got the brand new logo. It might be the first time you've seen it, unless you were lucky enough to be on that presentation yesterday. Do you know the word that came out of that presentation yesterday was the thing we all need to do in sustainability is to have a conversation. And that's what this is about. It's not trying to say my footprint is better than your footprint. It's trying to understand what drives the footprint and have a conversation as to where it's best to make the changes. So Muntons was the first maltster globally to be audited by SGS to prove that the FSA actually worked by the fact it was benchmarked then against Red Tractor. So Red Tractor is really important for the supply chain in terms of malting and brewing and foods, because it is the way that the UK industry aligns itself by default at the moment with the Farm Sustainability Assessment. Really important that we keep the Red Tractor standard as it is and improving in line with the FSA. So Muntons anaerobic digestion plant, it's fine talking about all these concepts, but what have we actually done as Muntons? The anaerobic digestion plant, just you can read quicker than I can go through all of the slides. So I won't bother doing that to try and offset some of the time we lost at the beginning. This is the plant. Our target was to create 10% of our site electricity using the high sugar waste. We process all our wastewater on site. We've saved thousands of miles in vehicle movements, and the material that comes off at the end of the process is centrifuged and dried and is a really highly nutritive fertilizer, which is able to be grown officially, used to grow malting barley because it has approval from the Environment Agency. So really good cradle to cradle project. And so by doing that, use a pretty sizable investment, yes, with a payback of just over 5 years, which is longer than we would have liked. But I think in sustainability projects, you might have to stretch those paybacks from maybe 3 to 5 or 6 years, but it's still the right thing to do. At Bridlington, we decided that we wanted to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions associated with kilning. We found that it was possible to use a biomass boiler. Now, bear in mind, we already had the world's most efficient boilers, the Varicon boilers up there, but this was even better in terms of emissions. We're using wood, which comes from forestry operations. That wood would have no other use other than to be left on the forest floor to rot. So we take that wood, we generate the same amount of CO2 as it would if it rotted, but we also get the heat out of it at the same time, hence it's renewable. And that's dropped our emissions by 90%. Again, it shows. If the first time I said biomass to you, you were thinking of Drax, maybe power station, the problems they had, and other people who've gone to Argentina to get wood chip in. We weren't doing any of that. We said, no, we must get the raw material from a regulated supply, Forestry Stewardship Council supply. It must come within the UK. Indeed, it must come very close to our factories, and it must have no other productive use than for biomass. You can do that. It won't be the only solution, but it's one of the solutions. So far we've talked about AD, one solution. We've talked about biomass, another solution. The picture that you've got down there, if you came past Stowmarket now, this is our energy centre in Stowmarket. We're trying to replicate that, but go even a step further. Here we're using biomass to generate the heat or the steam that we need on our site. And it will also then generate electricity at the same time. So we'll be almost self-sufficient, a whopping 60% saving in our emissions. Suddenly, if you're seeing those figures, 90%, 60%, that's quite good, isn't it, compared to maybe the figure that you heard yesterday, 78% that we're going to have to get by 2035. It's not possible. That still, of course, means that we've got a fair way to go, and we're already looking at targets for that. And you're perhaps thinking, well, what will they involve? If you've done all of this so far, is there anything left? So if you look at the UK malting sector, it emits quite a lot of CO2, but we know that, and knowing it is good. We know where it comes from. A lot of it comes from nitrogen fertilizer. We know that the fertilizer industry is already doing a lot, and I don't think it will be too long before they're actually going to get a zero carbon nitrogen fertilizer. They're well on the way. And we've said before that 60% of the embedded emissions are in malting barley. So we know where it all is. We know where to work. So what sort of things is the malting industry working on? Well, about 48% in a survey that was carried out are investigating heat generation from electricity. We're told that's the way to go. Electricity is a lot more expensive than gas, so we do need to find better ways of doing that. About 8% of industry is looking at use of hydrogen for heating, so I think that needs to go up. But around half are considering how to be carbon zero by 2050. Now, I think that's a little scary because it's a legal target in the UK that we have to be carbon zero by 2050. So a lot more of us need to be changing our attitude and looking to save far more carbon than we currently are saving. But we're not left on our own, because interestingly, if you look at what's possible now, there is a possibility of 64% decarbonisation of heat available in technologies that we've got now. And look what the electricity providers are saying. They're looking to effectively give us zero carbon electricity by just after 2030. So they're doing a lot to help us as well. But that doesn't mean that we have to sit back and just use that. What's interesting, I think, is that I believe that the whiskey industry has probably gained a march on the brewing industry here. That's quite controversial, isn't it, for the audience I'm talking to? Why do I say that? Because they've already managed to persuade the Department of Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy there to give them £10 million to invest in new technologies, which will then take us that extra bit towards carbon zero. And where's that money being spent? This is not private information. It's all out there. You can go and have a look at it and look at the projects and who's got the money. Interesting that already that innovation money, 59% of that money is going to look at the impact of hydrogen in reducing greenhouse gas emissions of the activities that go on there. So I think that's the challenge maybe to the brewers, to persuade BASE to give some money to do some innovation in brewing, but it's still a great thing that's happening in distilling. Hydrogen won't be the only answer, of course. It'll be one of those suite of measures that will get us there. And hydrogen has to, you can use a lot of electricity to generate the hydrogen as well from water. But again, if you get creative and you can put up a wind turbine, or you can put up some solar panels to generate that electricity, then you're on a much better wicket, I think, to choose this. So the important thing, I think, is to choose your battleground here. Choose the projects you're going to go. As I say, it's a suite of activities, but this is what we've loved to say about Muntons. We love sustainability because it drives innovation. It's Muntons' centenary year, and we think this is going to be a great way of moving our business forward for the next 100 years. And indeed, all businesses now are going to have that springboard. So we talk about it. What have we said? We're talking about sustainable malt, and we know what that means. We're talking about internationally relevant targets in terms of science-based targets and sustainable development goals. We do have a farmer support group to help get that message through called Sustainable Futures. We like to make sure that our measures are practical, so we call it practical sustainability, and I've shown you some of the case studies there. We're looking as well at plastic packaging. We're looking at the amount of waste that we produce. There are all sorts of things that you can get involved with. These motivate people, they motivate your stakeholders, and they motivate you, they challenge you to look for new ways to become more and more sustainable. So this is why, it's lovely. I like being able to say that we're super low carbon or ultra low carbon, and I can say that with confidence because I've got the figures to back it up. So I hope that's been of interest to you. Sorry for those teething problems at the beginning. I hope that you stayed with us and you're able to enjoy that. I'd like to leave you with some action points, though. I think there are 5 action points you can take away. So on energy, I think you need an in-depth measurement and action plan. And I hope I persuaded that we shouldn't and mustn't wait for new technology to make a step change right now. Also, you need to think about carbon efficiency. You do need to map your operations and your supply chain right now, find out where the hot spots are, and find out what you can do to facilitate greenhouse gas reductions. Make sure you set yourself a relevant target. Plan to achieve carbon zero or better. Offsetting Have I got the message across? It should be the very last thing you think about. There's plenty that you can do now, and I hope I persuaded you of some of that. But again, look for specific and measurable change across as wide a spectrum as possible. And so align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and then drive your business using all of those things to see how you can have an impact on people, on profit, and on planet. So I hope that's been of interest to you. You've got a couple of options of getting further information there. You can either contact me with my Muntons hat on, or you can contact me with my sustainability consultancy hat on, whichever you think is most appropriate. So end of commercial, and thanks very much for listening.